Welcome to Stand in the Gap Today from the American Pastors Network. We proclaim truth in the public square by connecting a biblical worldview and constitutional principles to the most significant news of the day. Simple, careful, then truthful. That's Stand in the Gap Today. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to the program. I'm Pastor Isaac Crockett, and the Honorable Sam Rohr, the president of the American Pastors Network, is joining us on this Friday edition of Stand in the Gap Today, and it's one of our opportunities where we get to kind of pick Sam's brain. Sam, so many times you're interviewing special guests and you're asking the questions, and a lot of times we take a Friday edition to put you in the hot seat, so to speak, and put you on the spot, putting the light on you and asking you the questions. So we get to ask Sam some questions today, and there's so much going on in the world, but one of the things that's driving everything is economics, finances, inflation. Just every day I'm seeing different videos on social media of people who, in many cases, are college graduates working what we would consider a good paying professional job, saying, I don't know how I can make ends meet. I don't know how I can pay my housing rent or mortgage and groceries and health care and, all these different things. I just can't make it. I'll talk more about it in this program, Lord willing, but there's an article by the Heritage Foundation that a friend sent Sam and I today, and it's saying that inflation is up at least 17% since Biden took office, and thousands of dollars out of the average American's paycheck, basically, as a result. But all of that, Sam, really, we're in a nation, though, that our national debt is just growing and growing. In fact, just a couple days ago on this program on Wednesday, you were talking about that with financial author and attorney Michael Snyder, and you looked at the economic health of our country, and it wasn't a very good grade that was given. And the future health, if we continue down the path we're going, your economist friend there, Michael Snyder, actually said would be a failing grade. And so that brings some interesting questions about what the Bible says about a balanced budget and debt. And so I thought, you know what, Sam, this would be a great topic for Ask Sam. Let's talk to you about this. And I want to set up, kind of a framework for how budgets are developed, what they represent, whether it's a government making a budget or a church, an institution, or just individuals and families. But I especially want to focus at the beginning here on how a government sets up a budget. And you were involved in that. You spent almost 2 decades in government as you were my representative in Pennsylvania, where I lived in Berks County at the time. You represented me. I voted for you, and I think you know that. But you spent a lot of that time making budgets and things. So before you give us a framework of how budgets, what all they mean and how significant they are, could you maybe also just tell us a little bit, I think you mentioned some on Wednesday, but what your experience was with, in government developing budgets and things?
Well, Isaac, I can, and I'll just give an overview here briefly, and that is this. Appropriations, the Appropriations Committee within government is generally perceived. If you're going to be on an important committee, everybody wants to get on Appropriations Committee. The reason for that is it determines what goes into the budget, and it determines spending, and not the taxes, but the spending. That is the appropriations. That's what it means, appropriating, taking available revenues and deciding where it goes, prioritizing where it goes. So everybody likes to be on appropriations because it becomes, at certain points of the year in the budget process, the single most important committee. Now, I was there because I asked to be there because I came out of business, and I thought, I understand this somewhat, but I wasn't begging to be on, and I didn't understand until later why some people were actually, they would beg and they would make deals and do all kind of bribing in order to try to get their way onto the committee. But it is an important committee. Second thing I learned by being on that committee, Isaac, is that from a process perspective, and we're not going to get into process until the next segment, but this is one thing I found, that the budgetary process and the Appropriations Committee, given that duty, is there to, on a regular basis, because some states are a one-year budget, like Pennsylvania was a budget every year. Some states only meet 2 times in one time, and they'll do a 2-year budget. Like Texas, as an example, does a 2-year budget because they only meet 1 time. But we did a 1-year budget. But whenever it's done, it is the time to review past spending, look at the budget in the past, find out what actually happened, and to anticipate what are you going to do in the future. And I think this is perhaps one of the most important things is that I found very early on governmental budgets, and I'm going to say home budgets too, they are a priority budget. I mean a process, meaning what you choose to spend your money on is the result of priorities, what you choose to be the most important. And there are always more demands than there is money to go around. Because I found that everybody comes begging to government because they want money. So I'll put that out there. And but within that context, Isaac, because of being a priority process, where does this money go? How much goes here? How much money goes there? I soon found out very clearly that there were some who felt that government ought to fund everything. And then there were only a very small few who thought the government ought not to spend very much at all. So as we talk about on this program, I didn't use the words back then like we use now, but really what it was is the budgetary process is a converging and a amalgamating of worldviews. Because worldviews ultimately determine choices and priorities. So that's really what that's what I learned by being on appropriations. It is a time of melding worldviews, negotiating based on worldviews, values that are made up of moral values, constitutional restraints, and an understanding of pure, raw money and economics.
And I think you said on Wednesday, 16 years you were on that committee. And could you give us an idea of how big of a budget? And I think you were also chairman of finances and things. It just mentioned those as we're about to go to the break.
Yeah. Well, budgets vary. Like on the federal, I mean, you're talking trillions of dollars. On the Pennsylvania state budget, there was about $30 billion that is appropriated. But federal monies that come into the state are almost equal to or more. So in the end, the monies spent, for instance, in Pennsylvania was over $60 billion. And you can take and do that for other states. Some states are much smaller. Some states like Texas could be larger. California would be a larger one. But you're talking tens of billions of dollars for most states, so it is a lot of money.
So very interesting. Well, what we want to do, you've already set this framework up that it is worldview that affects our priorities, and our finances always point to where our priority, where your treasure is, there where your heart be also. But we want to get into some of these details because it seems so mysterious sometimes to some of us. How does our government come up with this? So when we come back, we want to get into more details about that, and then we want to get down to the personal level too and see what the Bible teaches us, how we can be good stewards. Maybe you know somebody who's struggling financially. Maybe it's you, maybe it's somebody you love. We want to look for some practical biblical advice on all of these issues, so stay tuned. We'll be right back on Stand in the Gap today.
Family gatherings, favorite food, festive lives, and fun traditions usually fill much of the Christmas season, but for some, the holiday produces feelings of grief, missed expectations, stress, loss, and loneliness. The difficulties of life seem to be amplified during Christmas. But you are in good company. At that first Christmas, there was a young couple facing confusion, rejection, uncertainty, separation from family, and then having to give birth to their first child in a cave. Talk about stress, disappointment, and fear. Yet in the middle of that darkness came a light, the baby Jesus. John wrote in his gospel that Jesus took on flesh, dwelt among us, and became the light of the world. So no matter what you're facing this Christmas, the good news is that the Christ of Christmas is still our light and life. He is the love of God. This is Jamie Mitchell, and from all of us at the American Pastors Network, have a Merry Christmas, and may the light of God touch you this Christmas.
From the time our children are born until the moment they leave our homes as young adults, Christian parents are given the privilege and responsibility of guiding them into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. All during their growing years, they are influenced by the people and events around them. Sometimes these are out of our control, but many times we can make choices as to how they'll be educated, what church they'll attend, and the overall atmosphere of our home. If you've decided your child is best influenced by a biblical worldview education, you'll want to consider BJU Press homeschool materials. Dedicated to academic excellence, BJU Press offers a curriculum that not only assists you to pass along your values to your children, but makes it easy and affordable. The decisions made in response to the challenges and opportunities your child will face in life are largely determined by their internal spiritual compass. Is your child ready for the journey? Find out more at bjupress.com. That's bjupress.com.
Here's Twyla Brace with today's Health Freedom Minute.
Medicare data from 2019 found that the cost of treatment for the most expensive diagnoses was 8% to 15% lower in physician-owned hospitals. The researchers found that if similar pricing were available at traditional hospitals, Medicare could have saved $1.1 billion. The Affordable Care Act essentially prohibits new physician-owned hospitals from being built, or current physician-owned hospitals from being expanded. Advocates for traditional hospitals, such as the American Hospital Association, opposed physician-owned hospitals, so the Democrat-controlled Congress eliminated much of their competition. This allowed traditional hospitals to create monopolies and overcharge patients for medical care.
Help us secure health freedom for all. Visit cchfreedom.org. That's cchfreedom.org.
I'm Ruth Kramer with Mission Network News. South Korea's Constitutional Court recently overturned a 2020 law that stopped people from sending anti-regime information to North Korea. North Korean defectors in South Korea use helium balloons to carry leaflets and USB drives across the border. Voice of the Martyrs Korea uses a similar balloon launching approach to send Bibles in the North Korean dialect. There's more to this story at missionnews.org. And what's in a name? Greg Kelly has been the CEO of World Mission for 25 years. Now, the ministry is changing its name to Unknown Nations. Kelly says the heart behind the name change comes from Acts 1:8, when Jesus said, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth." For Unknown Nations, their goal is reaching people groups who don't know Jesus. Find your place in the story with Unknown Nations at missionnews.org. You've been listening to Mission Network News, a service of One Way Ministries. I'm Ruth Kramer.
You're listening to Stand in the Gap today. For more information, visit our website at standinthegapradio.com.
Welcome back to the program, and today we're talking about money, and I think that's on most people's minds this time of year and maybe any time of year. And we started out by talking to Sam about what a budget is, what appropriation committee is, things like that. And Sam has almost 20 years in state government experience and 16 years on that appropriation committee for his state, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which he was saying was tens and tens of billions of dollars of budget, oftentimes I think over $60 billion when you take all the federal money that came in. And so, Sam, you went through, and I thought it was really helpful the way you explained, of course, you're looking at the past to come up with the budget for the future. You're anticipating needs that are going to come up in the future, which is important to be able to accurately predict. But you said ultimately the budget is what Jesus says. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Our budget, whether it's a state government or a local church or an individual family, our budget is really a representation of and you use the word priorities. Our finances show us where our priorities are. And I thought that was helpful. And when I listened to the program on Wednesday of this week that you did about our nation's priorities and just this incredible amount of national debt that keeps growing, it was a wake-up call. It was frightening in many ways to hear, and I encourage our listeners to go back and listen to that program if they haven't listened to it yet. But it brought up a lot of questions for me. So, Sam, a lot of these questions, I'm very curious. But then also, I've been talking with lots of different people this week I've been in contact with, I think, about 10 different pastors, church groups, and things. Some of them I've spent a lot of time with. And then just other people, some of whom aren't maybe even believers, but they're conservative-leaning thinkers. And I hear a lot of the people questioning things. And so that's what we're going through. Is how does this work? How does this make sense? And you've been there for 16 years working on the inside of this in the government. So could you kind of walk us through from a government position how these budgets are made, kind of the process of developing the state budget from the initial stage, the Appropriations Committee or wherever it starts, all the way to approval, and then where it has to go next, to kind of finally get signed into law or whatever it has to be. And maybe also again you talked about somewhat of the importance of the Appropriation Committee, but how important that group is in working this budget through.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Isaac. Yeah, I'll just try to be as simple as I can because you can spend so much more time on it. But when we're talking budgets, all right, every entity that spends money should have a budget. If they produce it properly, it will guide them like a roadmap into what they do and where they go from a priority perspective and that kind of thing. But even if they don't have a budget, they in fact have a budget because a budget is simply what you do with what you bring in regard to what you put out or spend. So this is simple terms. There's revenue that comes in. It may be a lot, it may be little. And then there's money that goes out, and that's maybe a lot or a little. And in that money that goes out, the expenditures, the appropriations, some of that actually could go into savings, a rainy day fund a lot of states have as an example. But somehow the money that comes in the form of, for governments, taxes, is allocated, and that's what you spend out. So a budget, theoretically, in most states, it's supposed to be balanced. It's supposed to be balanced in the federal government too, but there are ways around it. They cheat, they lie, and there's a way to do it, and I can talk about that. But it's supposed to be balanced. What you appropriate, spend, should not exceed what you bring in, otherwise it's not balanced. I guess number one. Number two, the constitutions within our nation. Now, this is not communist China that has a dictator who determines what they're going to do. When I'm talking now, I'm talking a constitutional republic. The United States, the states and the federal, are bound by the Constitution. The Constitution takes and lays out overall responsibility. Budgets, appropriations, must start in the legislative branch, not the executive, not the judicial, the legislative, and specifically, in most all cases, if not all, it starts in the House, not the Senate. So it's a House-driven, because that's where the representatives of the people are. And in reality, properly understood, the allocation of the money, taxes collected, revenue, and the expenditures of it, properly understood, that money belongs to who? Not government. It belongs to the taxpayer, the people. So therefore, that's where you start getting into priorities there. And actually, whose money is this? And so that's another aspect. But the Constitution establishes the order. Comes out of the legislative branch, comes out of the House. Now, in reality, I found when I was in Pennsylvania that ultimately, when a budget is put into the process for a beginning as a bill for a vote and consideration in the process, it ultimately came from the governor's office. The legislature tends to let the governor take and put together the budget because ultimately he can veto the budget. And so that's where you get into these lengthy, protracted things where the president in the Washington level or the governor doesn't agree with the legislature and they have a big, long fight. They let the governor propose it and then they work it from there. Generally, that's how it is. That happens early on. In Pennsylvania, as an example, budget every year. The budget process starts in January, the first of the year, extends for about 6 months. Here in this state, and it's similar, different in other states, but it's similar, the budget has to be concluded and a new one passed by June 30. So it's 6 months for the process. It's put into place. The numbers are now evident. People can begin to look at it, and you have hearings. The hearings go for months. Who comes to the hearings? Every agency that expends the money. So who spends the money? The executive branch, primarily, that money. So Education Department, Welfare Department, Human Services, whatever it may be, they all come. Anybody who has money appropriate comes, and they make a case for what they did with the money, and they make a case for how much money they want, and that's when the appropriations members can begin to grill them, and that becomes a rather exciting and lengthy process. So there are hearings. Ultimately, there comes to be an agreement between the legislative branch in the House and the Senate working on the same thing, and the governor, and you end up with a budget. That at some point then comes before the House, which then goes to the Senate for a vote, and that is whether or not you have enough votes, a majority vote, to say we like these spending priorities. It balances. It doesn't. It has to balance theoretically. We like the spending priorities. We don't. If it passes the House, it goes to the Senate. If they agree on it, then it goes to the governor. If there is a disagreement along the way, and there almost always is, and it's almost always over spending priorities, always coming off of worldview. We may say it's a political difference. The Democrats spend differently than the Republicans, and that's true. But in most cases, it's worldview, and that's where the priorities come from. That is the process. Takes about 6 months, and then it's theoretically to be done. I will say this, though. Now, when people look at Washington, they have to have a balanced budget, too, and they have to have a balanced budget every year. But in reality, Washington has not actually gone through the budgetary process as prescribed for, I don't know, I think it's probably 12, 15 years. How do they get around it? They keep passing what they call continuing resolutions. People recognize that term. That is a slick statutory way to avoid discussions, full hearings, full accountability, and to bypass the difficulties of negotiation, which budgets always do because it's a competition, again, of worldviews and priorities. They've figured out a way to not actually have a budget, but continue to spend, and they call it continuing resolutions. It's a violation, but that's how it's done.
Sam, I think we have more questions than there will be time, because now that you've explained that, it makes a lot of sense, but it brings up a lot more questions. But I think maybe one of the helpful things in the few minutes we have in this part of the program would be, could you maybe give us some examples of differing worldviews? You mentioned that. Give us maybe some examples of how a Christian or a person who's following the Constitution could look at something and say, okay, we can do this, but we shouldn't do this maybe. And it really the more morality that comes out of budgeting.
Absolutely. And I'll just go to the national level right now, just to make it very simple. The Constitution, U.S. Constitution, gives no authority to the federal government to do anything relative to education or what we call welfare. Well, then why in the world is the federal government, one of the larger budgets, welfare related? And why is it education related if it's not their responsibility? Well, they figured out a way that if they can spend federal money and convince the states to take the money, they can ultimately control education policy and health care policy in the states. The states, though, have to take the money. If they take the money, they agree to the rules of the federal government, and that's why the states would love to take billions of dollars from the federal government. Education and welfare, two big examples. Federal government has the power. They've given it up in the states, but their benefit is they have tens of billions of dollars more to spend.
Wow. That is very interesting, eye-opening maybe. But we want to talk about more of this and kind of dig into more, to closer to home when we come back. And we want to look at what the Bible teaches us as stewardship, about taking on debt, things like that, whether national level or individual level. Don't go away. We'll be right back on Stand in the Gap.
When you tune in to Stand in the Gap today, you'll hear relevant, applicable information to help you better understand the cultural issues of our time. The biased liberal media narrative confuses and distorts the truth, but our hosts and guests provide focused analysis by combining personal experience with wisdom taken from God's Word. One of our frequent guests, George Barna, had this to say.
We know from the research that I've been doing that churches are not terribly interested these days in helping people to understand and know how to think biblically about the issues and the conditions and situations that we face. And so that's one of the things that I love about being on your show is that I know every time I go on, it's not just going to be an exercise. We're trying to push people closer to biblical truth. And that's worth getting out of bed in the morning for.
Tune in to Stand in the Gap today by visiting our website at standinthegapmedia.org. That's standinthegapmedia.org.
The United States boasts over 4 million miles of highways and public roads. Without accurate maps, though, and road signs, these roads are confusing. The road of life's no different. Thankfully, the Bible gives us needed markers and guidelines in the form of biblical commands and principles. Properly applying them is the difference between success and confusion when it comes to impacting our culture for Christ and being effective salt and light. For a gift of any amount to Stand in the Gap, we'll send you an attractive Stand in the Gap signpost with 4 simple questions and corresponding biblical principles about the toughest issues of the day, helping you to successfully travel the road of life. Use as a bookmark in your Bible, affix to your refrigerator, or give to a friend. Yours for a gift of any amount to Stand in the Gap. Partner with us right now at standinthegapradio.com. That's standinthegapradio.com.
With a woman to look at culture from a Christian worldview, I'm John Stonestreet with The Point. The 3-digit number 988 is quickly becoming as much a part of our shared life as 911. The Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is a national hotline that provides 24/7 free and confidential mental health support to anyone who needs it. In just the first year, 5 million contacts were responded to. These numbers are staggering, and the hotline continues to seek to find better ways to find high-risk populations. But suicide is a culture-wide problem. From 2021 to 2022, the suicide rate increased by 2.5%. Christians have to play a significant role in offering hope. Parents, teachers, pastors, and other mentors need to be equipped to spot vulnerable young people and to connect with them and point them to Jesus Christ, the source of all hope. The Hope Always course, featuring Dr. Matthew Sleeth, is available online. It can be accessed anytime and can be studied alone or as part of a community that's committed to providing healing to people contemplating suicide. Go to educators.colsoncenter.org for more information.
You're listening to Stand in the Gap today, discussing the pressing issues facing our culture from a biblical and constitutional perspective. Now let's rejoin our host.
Welcome back to the program, and if you're just tuning in or just joining us via the app or however you're listening, I've been talking with Sam. It's a Friday edition, Ask Sam. We've been talking about government budgeting in particular, but we want to really look at what the Bible teaches about finances and about stewardship of what God gives us, about debt and all of these things. And so, Sam, we're living in a difficult time. I mean, many people, not just young people, but a lot of young people are dealing with high levels of debt from their college loans. And then other people are dealing with debt from buying housing, and the housing prices have just skyrocketed in the last 20 years. And then there are folks who are trying to retire, and they can't retire because they don't have enough savings, enough retirement set up, all sorts of things going on. And you said that budgets, whether it's national, state, or even just our own family or church ministry, that budgets reveal our priorities. And so I think that, and you showed that it really goes back to worldview as well. And you shared some examples, and when you started to share these examples, it brought up a lot more questions from me. And so I would like to just have you talk about that maybe a little more biblically, what the Bible teaches us about corruption and debt and stewardship, because you were saying that constitutionally our Congress is not allowed to be funding certain things, and you listed several things that are a big part of our budget. And so I'd like to know what is going on there. Is that corruption, and how do they do that if it's unconstitutional? And is that really a form of bribery or some sort of, I think I used the word several times now, but is this some sort of financial corruption going on? And if so, what can we find out from the Bible about these things? Maybe you could make some sense of that for us. Sam.
Okay, I'll try, Isaac. I'm going to put this again. I'm not talking about an Islamic nation, dictators in China, where they make the decision. And I'm talking here in terms of what our people understand, and that is a representative republic, a constitutional republic. Our founders understood the nature of man. And that's in our book, God's Plan for a Blessed Nation. All of this is laid out. But our founders understood that people basically have a depraved heart. They're not disciplined. They're in rebellion to God. And they want to do their own thing where the strongest prevail. Now, under a biblical worldview, we say, no, God has a better way. You discipline yourself. You measure what you do. You consider what God says and his principles, and then you will reap good consequences. Now, this is how, back to your question of how this can happen. The Constitution says, federal government, you can't be involved in education. You can't be involved in welfare. That's a matter of the state. Or the states get involved and tell people what they're going to do with education for their children. The old homeschool laws where states were trying to tell people, parents, you can't homeschool your children. Years ago, those battles have been held. It's the same kind of thing. Ultimately, it's back to who's in charge, whose priorities. I'll go here. William Penn of Pennsylvania and our founders said this: our frame of government, a representative republic, is only possible if people subject themselves willingly to the dictates of the Ten Commandments of God, moral law, God's moral law. And they said you could not have a government, if it were put into place, survive if you didn't have people who were in office making the determinations about taxes and on appropriation committee spending, unless they also voluntarily submitted themselves to the same moral code, the Ten Commandments of God. Why is that? Well, because following the Ten Commandments recognizes that there is God, first couple commands. It also recognizes that thou shalt not steal, meaning ownership of property, which means you can't take taxes from people, even though you have the power, if it's not for something that God says government ought to do, or in our nation, what the Constitution allows you to do. Because if you do, it's theft. It's stealing. So, again, that's the practicality, or it's covetousness. Those in government say, well, if I just had more tax money, I could be Santa Claus and hand out money to everybody, and then they would come and bow at my feet, which they do, and they do that. That's covetousness. But Isaac, it's also on this hand, that if the people learn that they can actually go to their representatives or senators and they can figure out a way to get money from government, which they all want to do. That's what I'm saying. That's what happens on appropriations. Maybe people come and beg before you all the time. The lobbyists come and they whine and they dine you, and others want to come and want money that you don't have. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the taxpayer, but they want you to give it to them. When the people figure out what to do, then things are done. Now, I'm going to read a quote from you. I just brought it up here, if I can bring it back up. This is something Alexander Tytler is his name. He said this: a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidates promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship. And then it goes on and it talks about how the sequence is from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to apathy, from apathy to dependence, from dependency back into bondage. Isaac, that what he just said is what I have been saying. That is a biblical worldview. So God says, if you don't, and our founders say, if you don't view God owns it all, and he's put in place his moral code, of which includes thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet. If you don't follow yourself that, then government becomes the greatest mechanism of all because it has the power to put people in jail. You can, you see what's happening. So this concept of selfishness and greed, and depending upon where you are in government, you can hand out and you can take it from people in taxes. Or if you're just a person, you can go down to government and lobby them to give you more money. And lo and behold, you have a government, like our federal government right now, that's $34 trillion in debt, approaching $1 trillion a year in just interest payments. And it is what God says will happen. It'll collapse. It's impossible for it to go forward. But as that happens in federal government, it also happens in individual homes. You cannot spend more than you have without ultimately putting a noose around your neck and ending up in bondage.
Well, Sam, actually, that was where I wanted to go, because on Wednesday, you didn't just talk about the national debt from our national government. You talked about, as a nation, how much as individuals we are accumulating in debt, how little we have in savings unreserved for emergency situations and several things like that. I would encourage everybody, if you're listening today and you didn't listen to Wednesday's program, I would encourage you to go back to standinthegapmedia.org, or better yet, download our free app, Stand in the Gap app. Download that and listen to this interview that Sam did. But as we go from there, Sam, what kind of advice, where you are now, you're a father, a grandfather, you have this experience with the private sector, experience in government, experience in different ministries, helping them out with making decisions and budgets. What would you say to a young person who's maybe looking at something like college and looking at taking out a loan for a college education, or taking out a loan to buy a house or a vehicle, and they're trying to weigh it out? Should I do this? How should I know if I should take this loan out? I would love to have you speak to them, and then maybe also speak to the person who's further ahead in life. Maybe they're more middle-aged, and they've taken out loans, and now they're having a hard time making the payments, and they're wondering, how do I do this? How do I make ends meet in this economy we have with all the inflation we have? I'd just love to hear some practical biblical wisdom about stewardship from you to those different situations.
Isaac, I'll just start here. This is a principle that I'm telling you, it will never take a person to a wrong place. And that is avoid debt. Avoid debt at all cost. The scripture tells us that the servant or the borrower is servant to the lender. In Deuteronomy, God says that the blessed nation, told Israel, our nation was once in that place, if you do what I say in regard to, protecting people's rights as God's laid them out, and government does what government's supposed to do according to what God says it's supposed to do in Romans 13. If these things are done, God said, I will bless you as a nation, and you will become the head and not the tail. Meaning, people will come and they will borrow from you. You will not be borrowing from them. But God says, if you violate my principles, one of the first things that will happen is that you will become a servant to the people from whom you borrow. And that's what we said on the Wednesday's program. We've been borrowing and living beyond our means as a nation for a generation. How have we done this? We've printed money, which has destroyed the value of money. That's theft of a different type. And we've borrowed. We've gone to places like China and Japan who've bought our treasury bills, effectively purchased our debt. And now, who are we indebted to right now? Who are we most concerned about? China. Isaac, these are things that get into place. So I would leave it right here and we'll come back in the next segment. But avoid debt at all possible costs.
Well, that's very good advice, and advice that our nation has not heeded. And so when we come back, we want to close in praying for our nation and talking about what we can do, solutions, and looking at what does our nation need to do to get out of the debt debacle that we are in. So don't go away. We'll be right back on Stand in the Gap today. Finish this up talking about our finances.
Does your child struggle to learn in a traditional classroom setting? Do you find yourself wishing you could spend more time interacting with and training them in the ways of the Lord? Thousands of parents feel the same way, and that's why they've chosen to educate their children at home. This gives them the tremendous opportunity to not only ensure a biblical worldview education, but to instill Christian values and build stronger relationships along the way. If this sounds like something you're looking for, why not consider BJU Press Homeschool Resources? BJU Press offers a variety of programs tailored to meet your family's needs and accommodate your child's learning style. Their curriculum was created to challenge your child to think biblically and grow in godly wisdom while receiving an academically sound education. They offer traditional homeschool textbooks, online classroom, and distance learning. Take charge of your child's future by using BJU Press materials. Learn more at bjupress.com. That's bjupress.com.
For years, faithful Christians formed nonprofit foundations or trusts to preserve their ability to generously give to their favorite causes or ministries, even after their death. The problem? Professional managers, pressure from left-wing agendas, and even family members with opposing views hijacked the original donor intent. This is sad but true. But this subversion of purpose can be prevented. Hello, I'm Sam Rohr of the American Pastors Network, and I'm glad to recommend Capstone Legacy Foundation in Wayne, Pennsylvania, an experienced and capable Christian community foundation, established to help you set up a ministry, a giving structure guaranteed not to be hijacked, or a place you can donate cash or non-cash assets like stocks, bonds, or property. Capstone's designed to help you achieve immediate tax savings and give you needed time to decide how to prayerfully allocate your giving. Contact Capstone at 610-688-8890 or visit them at capstonelegacy.org. This week we focused on America's greatest problems: pride, ungratefulness, turning God's blessing to judgment, and broken families. But what's America's greatest problem? It's not the economy or education, it's the need for truth. Hello, I'm Sam Rohr with another Stand in the Gap Minute. All problems arise from the lack of knowing and living God's truth. Hosea 4:6 says, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." Today, America is being destroyed, not by an opposing army, but from within. The ultimate hope for our nation is not found in government, but in God. As we discover His biblical answers to our problems, we can live in a way that is truly blessed. However, if we operate according to a humanistic and pragmatic worldview, we'll only face increased judgment. So let's commit together to change our nation, starting with a personal embracing of God's truth. Discover more at AmericanPastorsNetwork.net.
Why don't they believe? This is Ken Ham, head of the ministry with the faith-building streaming platform Answers TV. All this week, we've been looking at amazing examples of God's design. Examples are everywhere, from the fine-tuned heavens that declare God's glory to the tiniest cell that screams His praise. So why doesn't everyone believe? Well, the book of Romans gives us the answer. It says that God's invisible attributes have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. Yes, we're all without excuse for rejecting our Creator, and yet people do. Not because of lack of evidence, but because they suppress the truth in unrighteousness.
Discover more about the truth of God's Word and our video streaming service when you visit us at AnswersRadio.com. That's AnswersRadio.com.
You're listening to Stand in the Gap today. For more information, visit our website at standinthegapradio.com.
Welcome back to the program, and I do hope that you'll go check out our website, as you've just heard, standinthegapradio.com or Stand in the Gap Media, or our Facebook, or download our app, because you can find out more information. You can find archives, you can find our TV show, all of that from there. But we're wrapping up this program on biblical finances, asking Sam about these things. And Sam, there's a passage that we often go to for child rearing in the book of Proverbs, chapter 22. Proverbs 22, verse 6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it." And I think that's got a lot of helpful wisdom, and I think unfortunately we have generations in our nation who have not trained children how to handle their finances correctly. Even our government hasn't been doing it correctly. But interestingly enough, that's verse 6. Verse 7 is another very familiar proverb. Verse 7 in that chapter says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is the slave of the lender." Sam, you just pointed out on our Wednesday program, and you said it again in our last part of this program, that our nation has borrowed. We're up to almost $34 trillion in debt. And much of that borrowing that we are slaves to is to places like China. Sam, what can we do as a nation? I know there are many people who feel hopeless about the mounting debt year after year, trillions of dollars added. But what would it take for America to start going in the right direction when it comes to our debt?
Isaac, there is no shortcut to God's blessings. There is no shortcut to healing and to health, be that spiritual health, physical health, economic health. Economically, we are sick. Why? Because we've made a lot of bad choices. If someone's listening to me right now and they've made a lot of bad health choices, I don't have a quick fix for them, or myself either. Anyways, people get the point. There's no quick remediation. Spiritually, there is. If a person's not saved, they're dead in their trespasses and sins. The Lord says, "Come to me, trust in me, and I will make you whole." All right. There is for the unsaved person a way for a very quick, like the thief on the cross went from spiritually dead to spiritually alive in a matter of a minute. Whenever he spoke to the Lord, he said, "You're going to be with me in paradise." That's all. But there is no quick restoration for economic or health type things. No. So there is no quick fix for our nation. You can't physically pay off $34 trillion. We're going to suffer through the consequences. We're already suffering through the consequences. I don't have time to go there. I think there's some things we can do. But if I can bring it back to us as personal, Isaac, personally, people listen to me right now, if they are economically sick, and I'm saying go there first for the debt. That's a practical part. If you're in debt, get out of debt as soon as you can. How do you do that? Well, stop spending. That is one. And then try to increase your revenue if possible. But Isaac, I'm going to take it back more than this. Fundamentally for the individual, it's a matter of priority that we talked about. It's a worldview. If a person fears God and keeps his commandments, they are on the very best track to economic and financial health. Now, what's that mean? Well, what that means is we got to make God's priorities our priorities. That means we understand that everything that we have, our finances, any assets we have, don't belong to us, they belong to God. We're stewards of them, and we're going to give an account to God for how we handle what he's given us. So that's number one. It all belongs to God. Secondly, when God gives us income, we must give back to him at least that first tithe. Off the top, we must tithe and give back to God and God's purposes because that's his command. There's an amazing thing that God will do. He will take that 90% that's left and make it go much further than what you felt was 100% to begin with. But can we trust God? That's another part. And then I think another one I put down is that we got to get rid of this worldly, satanic mentality that says it's all about me. And it's now. And I don't have to wait. And throw discipline out the window. And restraint. The world says, have it now and have it your way. And forget about the consequences, right? What is that? That's lawlessness. But that's what we see around us. Lawlessness and a rejection of God will lead to debt and will lead to God's judgment on a nation, on a family, as an individual. So it all belongs to God. give him the first amount, view yourself as a steward. You don't own it. You're entrusted to whatever it is. And then make those priorities that way and understand that choices do have consequences. Make bad choices, you're going to have bad consequences. There's nothing free in life except salvation. There's nothing free. Don't believe that lie the Bible tells you. And it's not your right that you have everything, young person, that your parents have when they're 60 or 70. It's not your right that you have everything that they have when you're 25. That's the world says, have it all and do it now. So in essence, Isaac, it's a lot of basic things, but it's a biblical world view, and it's a determination of a person that says, it's not my way that works out. God's got a better way. I'm going to find out what God's way is and follow it. That's how we get back to healing. For our nation, I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. We've got to go through some very rough waters before that will ever happen because we've gone so far down the road. That's my sense.
Well, and we're running out of time here, but just real quickly, what you were just saying about that feeling almost like entitled that I should have what my parents have. This biblical concept in the New Testament, we learn you reap what you sow, and you reap more than what you sow and things like that. It really describes what Proverbs 22 is talking about. Train up a child in the way he should go, and he'll be that way for life. And it goes into this, slave to the lender thing and all that is really teaching reap what you sow. Real quickly, so many times the American dream has equated, I want my kids to have a better life than me. That means I want them to have a higher education, a bigger house, a better car, those sort of things. Yet inflation right now, that article I was reading from the Heritage Foundation, 17%, they said that the typical American family has effectively lost $7,300 in annual income under Biden. Can we keep going bigger and bigger and bigger, or do we need to start to realize that we have to discipline ourselves to live on less and to live with less, possibly?
Yes, Isaac, we have to discipline ourselves. I bought my first house in 1980. You know that the value of that dollar in 1980 is now about 70% of what it was in 1980. I bought my first home for $40,000. Yeah, believe it or not. A new home right now is $425,000. And the median income right now is $36,000. Isaac, we are so far into the Alice in Wonderland experience, mythical. People don't understand what a dollar is. And so we've got to come back to grips with what really is. And again, that's biblical truth and what God says. I'm just going to go back to that again. God owns it all. We're stewards. Give him what he deserves first. Make our spending priorities what God says are important to him, and really believe that discipline is something that is biblical. You don't have to have it all right now.
Well, folks, that's a wrap on this program. If you've listened to this program, any of it or all of it, please would you take a few minutes right now just to pray and ask the Lord to guide and to give mercy to our nation. Pray for young people and old people as well who are having financial difficulties right now, that the Lord would give them wisdom and mercy, and they would discipline themselves to the glory of God. Thanks for listening. Stand in the gap today wherever you are.
If you liked today's program, tell a friend. You'll also want to hear Stand in the Gap Weekend and watch the nationally syndicated Stand in the Gap TV program. We present the news of the day truthfully, carefully, and consistently from a biblical worldview and constitutional perspective. If you're hungry for the truth, visit standinthegapmedia.org to find all our programs and the stations that carry them. While you're there, be sure to download our free app and support this ministry with your best financial gift.